Last month, I came across a term I had not heard before, but that I instantly, intuitively felt I understood: relationship minimalism. We're pretty familiar now with minimalist movements. We use it to describe some forms of art or music. You can have minimalist architecture. But mostly these days, what we talk about when we talk about minimalism is lifestyle. The most visible icon of this streamlining trend is Marie Kondo, the queen of clean herself, author of The Life-Changing Magic of Tidying Up. She made the move to TV in 2019, and she's just got a new Netflix series out. Marie Kondo is all about looking around at the stuff in your life, in your home, and asking the fierce question, does it spark joy? If you hold that pair of jeans and nothing, chuck it out, banish that sucker. It is clutter. Life is too short for harbouring anything that does not spark joy. Relationship minimalism seems to follow more or less this principle, but applied to people instead of T-shirts. A recent Guardian article told the stories of a number of young people who are embracing this new practice. Ronald Banks is a YouTuber living in Wisconsin. He started by Marie Kondoing his enormous wardrobe as a 21-year-old. But Banks, who is now in his late 20s, doesn't stop at discarding clothing or furniture. He's also getting rid of relationships that do not serve him any longer. He is part of a group of young people who are not only eschewing excess material items, but also meaningless relationships and excess emotional clutter. If their friendships are non-satisfactory, they declutter, opting for fewer but more quality relationships. If the city they live in no longer sparks joy, they move. And in a quest to trim down the amount of unnecessary emotional engagement with the world, some don't even use smartphones or social media. The article doesn't dive deep into what counts as emotional clutter or a more quality relationship, and it does also chronicle how some of these influencers have become disillusioned with their minimalism journey. But I found myself wondering how these stories, this move away from relationship mess, might intersect with a different story that's been emerging over the last decade or so, the loneliness epidemic. The latest research, a survey of Australians commissioned by Telstra and conducted by YouGov, reported that 9 out of 10 Australians experience loneliness, with 44% of us saying that we regularly feel lonely. 24% say they don't feel they have anyone to talk to. 35% say they rarely or never feel like they are part of a group of friends. And 48% say they're too embarrassed to admit feelings of loneliness to others. Half of Australians feel they can't talk openly about something that 90% of people say they feel at least some of the time. And of course, COVID has only made things worse. 27% of Aussies reported experiencing loneliness for the first time during COVID. 38% said they have never felt lonelier than they have in lockdown, which is probably not so surprising. Crises have a way of making visible, of surfacing things that were bubbling away underneath before. People who were thrilled with their Marie Kondoed apartments before COVID reported that they had some regret about throwing out so much stuff after finding themselves confined to their homes for months on end. Similarly, I wonder how relationship minimalism has fared over this past year or two compared with previously. Has COVID clarified for us who the important people in our lives are and made us feel like the rest are kind of take them or leave them? Or has it deepened our sense of need for a wide, tough, enduring web of relationships, or a bit of both? Let me say that I definitely feel the pull, the appeal of minimalism, of purging your life of the unnecessary, of making everything sleek and tidy and having it under control. I haven't yet been able to bring myself to Marie Kondo my possessions, like I get a bit sentimental. But I do love having my space and bringing order to it. I can't concentrate if there's clutter. And being a classic introvert, I certainly get the appeal of relational decluttering, of streamlining your social life as well. Long before COVID, I embraced the motto of the 30-something introvert: the best plans are cancel plans. I opted to wear my "I'm sorry I'm late, I didn't want to come" pin today, though I am glad I'm here, mostly. I always seem to be craving more alone time. Like, I enjoy seeing my people, but also I fill up pretty quickly, and not infrequently I'm like, okay, that's enough people time. Have I been here for long enough that it's not rude to go home already? But every now and then I get the desire of my heart and my busy schedule dies down for a while, and I think, for about a day. And then I realize that I should be careful what I wish for. Relationships are messy and complicated and tiring, but surprisingly to me, and maybe only to me, my neat, decluttered life, when I experience pockets of it, it's kind of thin and unsatisfying by comparison. So let's talk a little bit about mess and friendship and mess, about this new fashion for relationship hygiene, why it's tempting, why it's sterile. I want to read to you a little from a novel that I finished reading recently. My background is in English literature. Maybe they should have warned you. It's the new novel from Sally Rooney, a young Irish writer who has been called the voice of a generation. Her latest is called Beautiful World, Where Are You? And in it, a successful young novelist called Alice is writing to her oldest and at this point almost her only friend, Eileen, about friendship and community. And at the end of their 20s, feeling kind of allergic to commitment, but also a bit dissatisfied about that. Alice says, "In public, I'm always talking about care ethics and the value of human community. But in my real life, I don't take on the work of caring for anyone except myself. Who in the world relies on me for anything? No one. I can blame myself, and I do, but I also think the failure is general. People our age used to get married and have children and conduct love affairs, and now everyone is still single at 30 and lives with housemates they never see. Traditional marriage was obviously not fit for purpose and almost ubiquitously ended in one kind of failure or another, but at least it was an effort at something and not just a sad, sterile foreclosure on the possibility of life." Pay attention to this part in particular. "Of course, if we all stay alone and practice celibacy and carefully police our personal boundaries, many problems will be avoided. But it seems we will also have almost nothing left that makes life worthwhile. I guess you could say the old ways of being together were wrong. They were, and that we didn't want to repeat old mistakes. We didn't. But when we tore down what confined us, what did we have in mind to replace it? I offer no defense of coercive heterosexual monogamy." She's really not a fan of marriage, "except that it was at least a way of doing things, a way of seeing life through. What do we have now instead? Nothing. And we hate people for making mistakes so much more than we love them for doing good, that the easiest way to live is to do nothing, say nothing, and love no one." I think that's so insightful. We hate people for making mistakes so much more than we love them for doing good, that it's easier to just do nothing, say nothing, love no one. That's life on Twitter, right? And increasingly, it's offline life as well. The voice of a generation. Relationships are risky and burdensome. They impinge on our independence. They mess up our carefully curated selves and schedules. They tie us down and make us vulnerable. They demand energy and patience and self-awareness and forgiveness. Here's what C.S. Lewis wrote in his book, The Four Loves. It was published 60 years before Rooney, but it's tapping into something very similar. He says, "To love at all is to be vulnerable. Love anything and your heart will be wrung and possibly broken. If you want to make sure of keeping it intact, you must give it to no one, not even an animal. Wrap it carefully round with hobbies and little luxuries. Avoid all entanglements. Lock it up safe in the casket or coffin of your selfishness. But in that casket, safe, dark, motionless, airless, it will change. It will not be broken. It will become unbreakable, impenetrable, irredeemable. To love is to be vulnerable. Friendship is messy because people are messy. How do you go with mess? Do you find yourself in a tangled situation and naturally try to draw back, extricate yourself, or lean in, pay more fierce attention, commit? My instinct is certainly to withdraw, but I have slowly become convinced that the opposite is both right and rewarding, that way lies joy, richness, fullness, pain as well, awkwardness, scary vulnerability, sometimes betrayal, irritation, but joy. Speaking for myself, this is a lesson I have slowly learned, mostly from being part of a church community, or a few of them. One of the challenges of contemporary life is that participation in community organisations is much lower than it used to be. There's a lot of research tracking this, that we're less involved than previous generations in voluntary civic groups, whether that's charities, community projects, neighbourhood groups, sports teams, political parties, hobby groups, or of course, religious groups. There are some trends the other way, some movement towards recovering some of that thicker social texture. There are things like men's sheds, nextdoor.com, allotments and so on. But we have a long way to go. Lots of us, after leaving school and university, find that we no longer have places in our lives where we experience a lot of incidental contact with a lot of people without having to make a deliberate effort. In those spaces, we had frequent opportunities for cultivating friendships with some people, for being friendly with many more people, for people to notice how we're doing, and for us to notice how they're doing. Some people have workplaces that are a bit like that. Parents may find they're drawn into a thick community through their kids' schools. But the young people in Sally Rooney's novel exist in that no man's land between uni and parenthood, and they struggle with loneliness, with disconnection from others, and with uncertainty and fear around what it would require for things to be different. And I would say fair enough. What it requires is a lot. I want to talk briefly here about my experience of church, less because I'm trying to convince you that, here is your solution, and more because I want to try to explain my own struggle with this paradox, wanting to withdraw, feeling compelled to lean in. Churches are places where a bunch of very random people come together. Some are like each other, some are nothing like each other. Many are awkward, many are struggling, all of us at some point. We may or may not form natural friendships. But the Bible that we read together with great seriousness rather audaciously says that we are to consider each other family. Family, non-negotiable, interdependent, for each other, committed to one another, year in, year out, ups and downs. This Bible also says, mourn with those who mourn, rejoice with those who rejoice, which means we end up doing more mourning than we otherwise would. Also, it means the joy is multiplied exponentially. It's tempting to opt out in various ways and at many points. And we do that too. We fail each other pretty regularly. Really, the reason that we persevere is not because we're clever and strategic about friendship and happiness and escaping the loneliness epidemic. It's because we believe this story about God, that he looked at the mess that is us, all of us, humanity, the world, and that instead of withdrawing from the mess, decluttering, shedding excess emotional baggage, he moved towards it. This is the Christmas story, actually. Christmas coming up, after all, not to freak you out. God leans in so hard to the mess of being human that he actually becomes human. He chooses entanglement. He accepts the pain and the suffering that comes along with it. He accepts vulnerability. What more perfect picture of vulnerability than a helpless newborn? It's the Christmas story, really, that clinches for me the case that optimizing my friendships, practicing relationship minimalism, extreme introverting, is not going to make my life smooth and sunny. It's not going to be fulfilling. That the opposite is true, that it's out of the mess and the entanglement, the being tied down and burdened by others and being a burden to them, that something beautiful emerges. I've got nothing against the life-changing magic of tidying up, but I've also grudgingly, gradually, with constant stumbles, become convinced of the life-changing magic of messy relationships.